In July 1946, a horrific war criminal went to the gallows, and he was flanked by two guards who oversaw that he faced the executioner and did not make a run for it. The hangman secured the noose around his neck and then sent him crashing through the trapdoor. Arthur Greiser was known as the Butcher of Poznan, and he was known for being one of the most brutal Nazis of the Second World War, and he was a man who was responsible for the slaughter and deaths of thousands. He was amongst many who were executed at the end of the conflict for his actions, but there were thousands more members of the SS and of the Nazi hierarchy who managed to evade capture and escape their day in court. Join us today as we look at the execution of Arthur Greiser, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Arthur Greiser was born in January 1897, and little of his upbringing would suggest he would later turn into a monster. During the First World War, Greiser volunteered to work inside of the Imperial German Navy, and rather than being based on vessels, he served inside of different naval forts. But then he traded the coast for the trenches of the Western Front, and served as an observer, but also he was involved in the dangerous work of mine clearance. He then changed again to be part of the Naval Flying Corps, but during one flight he was shot down, and was hurt and wounded by the gunfire. But he was then classified in September 1919 as 50% war disabled, and because of this he was released from the Navy. For his First World War service, he was given the Iron Cross First Class. However, after the conflict, he joined the Freikorps, as he was not very impressed with the concessions that the new German government made with the Treaty of Versailles. This imposition caused chaos across Germany. For example, they were banned from having an army of more than 100,000 soldiers, and they were also not allowed to have an air force. But Arthur Greiser was someone who was said to have been very anti-Christian and rebellious, and he quickly noticed the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. He was an early member of the German Social Party, a nationalistic group, but he then switched his allegiance to the Nazis, and also then joined the SA, Hitler's brown shirts, in December 1929. 2 years later, Greiser joined the SS, and quickly he rose throughout the ranks of the paramilitary group. Greiser was seen by Hitler and Himmler, as well as others, as someone who could be trusted in a position of power, and he was then made the deputy president of the free city of Danzig, before he was then made the Senate president of the area. Greiser was in particular a close acquaintance and friend with Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, and also Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. But inside of the city of Danzig, Greiser could do whatever he wished in the land, and he took great steps to offend Polish people and also diplomats. He sent rude notes and messages to Polish politicians about the city and created a lot of anger. However, following the German invasion of Poland, he then became the chief of the civil administration for Poznan, which was then incorporated into the German Third Reich. Greiser then became appointed the Gauleiter of Reichsgau Poznan, and he was named the Reich Defence Commissioner of the created military district. Because of this, he was then given a number of promotions within the SS, and the land that he was responsible for became very rich, and this wealth was then absorbed into the Nazi hierarchy. But Arthur Greiser was a brute in this region, and he oversaw it with much horror and evil, and he was incredibly anti-Semitic, and he forced Polish people out of the lands and ordered them to resettle in other places. He was a man who carried out the ruthless policies of Heinrich Himmler, and he executed civilians who were said to have been defiant and resisting. It was claimed about Arthur Greiser that he was a powerfully built figure. He was a tall man, and you could see his arrogance, his conceit. He was so vain, so full of himself, as if there was nothing above him, a god almost. Everybody tried to get out of his way. People had to bow to him, salute him. And the Polish he treated with great contempt. For him, they were slaves, good for nothing but work. He once said during a speech that, "No longer must we stand in the wings, we must altogether become a master race." But it was inside of these lands where the Nazis carried out horrific attacks against the civilian population, with Greiser being the one who signed off on much of this. He used SS men to take 1,558 civilians from mental hospitals, where they were then gassed inside of the Soldau concentration camp in summer 1940. Greiser also moved Germans into the lands which had been conquered in the Soviet Union following the launching of Operation Barbarossa. He was a man who had great contempt for the church, and he cut off support from the church and sent many church officials, priests and members of the clergy to concentration camps, and there some of them were executed, being shot dead. 1,700 priests from Poland were sent to the Dachau concentration camp, and many succumbed to starvation, disease, and the horrific slaughterous policies of the camp. But Greiser was one who wanted to punish members of the clergy further, and he wanted the deadly policies of the Holocaust to be enacted very early on. He argued with other Nazis, including Hermann Göring, about why it was taking so long to rid the Jews from the city of Lodz, and he then was told by Himmler himself in September 1941 that 60,000 Czech and German Jews were to be sent to the Lodz ghetto. He then asked if he could slaughter 100,000 inside of his region. Arthur Greiser used gas fans to execute many. Inside of the lands that he oversaw, around 150,000 Jews were killed between autumn 1941 and April 1942. He continued to also have civilians strung up and executed to strike fear into the hearts of other people. As the war continued on, he did not waver in his devotion to the Nazi cause and was seen as one of the most horrific local leaders and governors. His campaign of terror led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and as the Second World War turned against the Germans in January 1945, he ordered an evacuation of the region of Poznan, as the might of the Soviet Red Army was advancing towards the area. Arthur Greiser himself left the city, and he then reported to Heinrich Himmler aboard his train, but he was then stabbed in the back by specifically Martin Bormann, a man who he believed he was on cordial terms with. Bormann had lied to look better in Hitler's eyes, but he wanted to make Greiser look bad and wanted to step on his toes. Bormann ordered for Poznan to be held and then defended, but Greiser was said to have been a deserter and a traitor as he left the area behind, and Hitler then, through Bormann's manipulations, viewed Greiser in this manner. However, he had more things to be worried about as the American army approached Austria, where he was hiding, but he then surrendered himself to the American army as he knew the Second World War was well and truly over. Arthur Greiser must have known that he would probably have been taken to the hangman's gallows for his actions during the conflict as a war criminal. He was handed over to the Polish government as a majority of his crimes were committed inside of the lands, and he was then tried for war crimes. He claimed that he was only following the orders given to him by a superior officer, and that orders were sent from men such as Himmler, but the defence of just following orders was considered not to have been good enough. He was portrayed as one of the most barbaric Gauleiters, and he was then convicted of a huge number of crimes, which included the murder of civilians and prisoners of war, as well as torture, persecution, destruction of the Polish culture, looting, stealing children against the will of their parents, slaughter in the ghettos, and much more. He was then sentenced to death by the Polish court and was to be executed by hanging. In July 1946, on a sunny morning in Poznan, Arthur Greiser, the brutal local leader of the region, was taken out to his execution in front of a crowd of around 15,000 people. These civilians were stood in the grounds of what was known as the Citadel, a fortress which had during the war been damaged heavily by bombing and reduced to rubble. Before 7 a.m, a car containing the condemned drove through the crowds, and out stepped Arthur Greiser. He was blindfolded and dressed in a suit. Next to him were two guards, who held him and guided him up the steps of the gallows, which had been specifically built for his execution. Whilst Arthur Greiser was stood on the gallows, His hands were secured behind his back, and he stood there staunchly, without any emotion, and mumbled a number of prayers to himself before the executioner approached him. He did this despite the fact he was clearly not a very religious man. He had seemed to accept death, and it was on the horizon, and he did not ask for forgiveness at all, and neither did he act defiantly. The executioner was dressed all in black, and he then secured the noose around his neck before taking some final checks, and with this then pushed the lever which sent Arthur Greiser crashing through the trapdoor. He was confirmed dead in minutes, and as an act of disgust and protest against Greiser's actions and crimes, the executioner threw away his white gloves that he had used to hang Greiser. He was a man who was not the most well-known Nazi, but Arthur Greiser should be remembered alongside Rudolf Höss and other evil overseers of lands and concentration camps, because he was responsible for a huge amount of slaughter. The crimes outlined by the court were endless and horrific, and it showed what a truly terrible man he really was. Greiser was a Nazi who wanted to eradicate hundreds of thousands of people, and he would carry out the wishes of his superiors, such as Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. He was a man who complained that the terrible policies of the Nazis were not being carried out quick enough, and he ruled over his region with complete terror. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.